Stanford University.
The guest speaker for today is Bill Crowell. We'll be discussing network and information security, reflecting on the past with Bill's wealth of experiences ranging from the NSA to the private sector, and then also the look ahead in terms of future implications on network and information security. So Bill Crowell has had a very long and illustrious career in the security realm. He was former deputy director of the NSA, appointed by President Clinton, and held in this role of deputy director, the highest ranking position for a civilian in the agency. He also served on a number of different government roles in terms of the President's Export Council. He was also on the Senior Advisory Group as its chairman for the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence for the US, as well as on the Science and Technology Advisory Board for DHS, Department of Homeland Security. His background in the private sector rivals that within the public sector. So he was former CEO and president of Sidelink Corporation, which was a public company prior to its acquisition by SafeNet. He was also chairman and board director of a number of companies that got acquired, whether it was by HP, Cisco, Boeing, and has invested in a number of cybersecurity companies. So Bill, for today's session, want to touch upon some highlights from your background and various national security projects that you've worked on, as well as then some topics related to current security issues that we face and some of the key attack vectors that are important. And then finally, some other global implications and general topics in terms of security with IoT, global implications of quantum computing on security, and just a few other topics that students have expressed interest in covering. So thanks for taking the time, and we'll go ahead and get started. So during your time at the NSA, around 1943 until 1980, there was a project called the Verona Project at NSA. And for the class, that was a counterintelligence program designed to decrypt messages transmitted by the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union, such as KGB, GRU. Can you share with the class what your role was in that project and just provide as much as you can of a brief overview of some of the challenges that were faced in developing that program?
I'd be happy to, Ernestine. And first, I'll start by saying I wasn't there at 1943. So you have to understand that I came into the game much later. That project was started in 1943 during World War II. It was a very controversial project, and therefore it became what's called a green door project. No one could get in unless they were specifically cleared for it. It was jointly done with the FBI and NSA, and it was directed against Soviet intelligence. It's a success story beyond belief, and I had three things that I managed to do as a part of that program. I came into it in the mid-70s. It had been in existence, actually in 1973. It had been in existence since 43. In 1948, it produced its first decrypt of KGB communications. And that decrypt, I actually remember it quite well. The words start out that Antenna's wife, Antenna was a cover name for a Soviet agent. Antenna's wife, Ethel, age 32, has two sons, helps her husband in his work, and has been quite effective in dealing with our mission, meaning the Soviet mission. That was Julius and Rosenberg. That's who the message was about. And of course, the famous Rosenberg case was decided by information that came from that message. All in all, 200 agents were identified. By the time I came into the program, about 60 of them had either been neutralized in terms of they left the United States, they went back to the Soviet Union, or they went elsewhere in the world. One of them went to the UK and was a professor at Cambridge. My second job, besides supervising the project when I came on board, was to determine just how long this should run. I mean, how many years were we going to actually try and break messages that only dated from 1943 to 1948? And I made a determination that it would continue until about 1980, when all of the agents that were identified would have been too old or too displaced from the Soviet mission that they wouldn't be worthy targets for US counterintelligence. And the third part that I played was that I convinced the director, well, actually the director of CIA and Senator Daniel Moynihan, that we should honor the people who worked on that project for more than 30 years. And so we had a ceremony at CIA in which we unveiled to the American public that the project had been successful. If you go on the nsa.gov website, you search my name, you will find a speech that I gave in the CIA headquarters to the public and to the 40 or so people who had worked on the project that were still alive. And you can find out a lot of facts about the project.
Thanks for sharing that, Bill. So you weren't at the NSA in 1943, but you were there when you were Deputy Director of Operations from 1991 to 1994. And one of the projects you were in charge of was running its core signals intelligence missions. I know this was one of the 5 groups that was under Director John McConnell based on the structure of the organization at the time. Could you discuss with the class the field of signals intelligence and why it was an important area?
Yeah. Signals intelligence is the intercept of radio communications in that day, because the internet wasn't really in existence yet. It was a couple more years, 3 more years before it came into existence. But it's the intercept of radio communications of foreign nations in order to produce intelligence. And it included military intelligence, that is, information that was very critical during wartime, the communications of military forces as they moved around. You probably read stories about World War II and the war with the Japanese, in which we won the battles of Coral Sea and Midway by virtue of having intercepted their war plans for those 2 battles. There were a lot of successes through the years in intercepting communications, diplomatic communications, military communications, and strategic communications, that is the communications of leaders and leadership and negotiations being carried on around the world. I'd say the most important thing that happened during my tenure as the Deputy Director for Operations was that the agency realized that the world was going digital, and radio communications, particularly long-range radio communications, we're moving to fiber and microwave and cable and many other, and satellites. And so we needed to modernize. And I was fortunate enough to be the person who guided that modernization. So we brought 17,000 military people who had been doing that job overseas at military bases in Germany and Japan and many other places, some of which I had served at. And we brought them home and we put them into facilities here in the United States, and we remoted their operations to those facilities in the United States. But then we added mission, we added satellite communications and all the other modes of communication so that they had a much more enriched mission and they could do a much better job of producing intelligence from all of the kinds of signals, not just radio signals, but those that came from many other sources as well.
That was quite the project and effort. So one other topic I do want to cover from your background is following that position of Deputy Director of Operations, you then became Deputy Director of the NSA from 1994 to 1997, which I mentioned in your intro is the highest ranking civilian role at the organization. And essentially you acted as the group's chief operating officer. I think this was a pretty interesting time to be at the NSA from a historical perspective, given the recent fall of the Soviet Union then, and a number of new threats that were brought about by the end of the Cold War, such as personal computers, cell phones, car-based telephones, and those became much more widespread. Could you talk a little bit more what some of these new threats that were emerging were, especially at the end of the Cold War?
Well, I had worked the Soviet problem earlier. I'd been the head of the organization that targeted the Soviet Union. So when I became deputy director, it was very clear to me that although we weren't going to focus on Soviet Union anymore because it didn't exist anymore, we were going to have a lot of new threats around the world. The one that bothered us the most was terrorism. Osama bin Laden had not emerged yet during my tenure there, but terrorism was increasing around the world. Afghanistan was certainly becoming a center of terrorist training. There were many other places like Ethiopia, of course, Palestine and Central Africa and so on that were spawning terrorist threats. And so that was a big thing because the communications of terrorists were very ethereal, very, very difficult to find. First of all, they didn't announce I'm a terrorist. And every one of them was named the same thing in their communications. Even if they used their real names, a lot of them were named Mohammed. So that was a terrific problem. The languages were a problem. All kinds of languages were involved in the terrorism problem. And so it was a very difficult thing to deal with. The other emerging problems were the emerging nuclear threat in other countries of the world. We already had India, Pakistan, France, UK, and a few others that we don't mention because they don't admit that they have nuclear weapons. But we had the emerging nuclear threats in North Korea, the difficulties with Iran, and so on. And so that became a focus of a lot of attention. Again, a very difficult problem because the communications of the nuclear scientists and so on were cleverly hidden and merged into the general communications of each of those nation states. And then there was the missile and all of the high-tech weapons programs that were going on around the world. And again, language problems getting into the depths of their activities were very, very difficult. So a lot of tough, what we call hard targets. Iran was a very hard target. North Korea was a very hard target. And those hard targets, nevertheless, were the most important things that the US felt it had to deal with during those times. I left in 1997. You recall that Osama bin Laden became a real problem in late 98, early 99, and of course in 2001.
So fast forwarding today, I do want to talk about some of the current challenges that we face in security. And Bill, you and I have talked about previously 4 key attack vectors being supply chain attacks, ransomware, APTs, advanced persistent threats, and phishing. Would love for you to dive into those 4 key attack vectors in more detail. And then also both Ashley and Colin from our class wanted to touch upon a few related things in terms of Ashley wanting to know a little bit more about some of the big problems that the industry is trying to solve. Perhaps I think it might be helpful to put that in the context when describing the 4 key attack vectors. And Colin's also very interested in touching upon consumer security and what we should be doing to safeguard ourselves and our information.
Yeah. So by now, every one of you should know what a supply chain attack is. We've been reading about them over the last month. The most famous was the SolarWinds attack, which was just revealed. I can tell you from open sources, that is commercial sources, that the SolarWinds attack, the supply chain attack involving SolarWinds software, began as early as February of 2020 and wasn't discovered until December of 2020. We still don't know how many companies have been compromised. The numbers range from 200 to 18,000 companies that were compromised. Supply chain attacks are really insidious. Essentially, the hackers or attackers, whichever name you want to give them, attack the source of software that's in current use by both commercial and government users. And they wind their way through the networks that serve those suppliers, and they try to find their way into what's called the DevOps. That is the development operations where code is being written. And then they make changes to the supplier's own code. The most popular in the case of SolarWinds change being to essentially change the update mechanism so that it provided updated copies of the software to their customers that allowed entry into each customer's network. And that's a very insidious attack. By the way, it's not a new attack, but it's a very insidious one. And it leads to the second vector that I talked about, which is APTs, or the advanced persistent threats. Because once you can get in, then you can begin leaving pieces of software in place in each of the targeted companies or government agencies that allow you to repeatedly enter and remove files that you want to remove, or remove emails, or to even go so far as to be able to deal at the keyboard level and capture keystrokes. So you can capture more passwords, you can extend your footprint within someone's networks until you get to all of the critical pieces, their R&D, their software development, all of the things that are important to companies today. The third vector is ransomware, and I would assume that most of you have heard a lot about it. What you haven't probably realized is the most targeted entities in the United States for ransomware up until recently were health facilities, hospitals, and health suppliers, wellness and health centers. Why? Because that data is critical to them, and they can hold it for ransom and collect pretty good numbers in their ransom. But recently it's expanded a great deal to where it now also includes things like government agencies and many other people who have critical, very confidential information, which they essentially encrypt and hold for ransom. And you can't decrypt it unless you pay them the ransom. By the way, encryption is very effective these days. If you don't have the keys, the chances of you decrypting it are almost nil. I'm quoted on the internet in a famous case that I was involved in as saying that AES 128, that's the less effective form of the advanced encryption standard, would require all of the computers in the world 12 trillion times the age of the universe to break one message. That's pretty powerful encryption. And so you don't break it by brute force. You have to be more clever than that. And so ransomware is extraordinarily effective. And finally, I would assume that every one of you has received a phishing email recently. I receive about 10 to 15 a day. They're called spear phishing in my case because my name is associated with a lot of companies that are in the cybersecurity world, and also is associated with government agencies that have secrets. And so they try every way in the world to get me to click on links. I just don't click on any links. But phishing is the most popular way of finding your way into somebody's network and being able to exploit it.
Colin, Ashley, anything you wanted to ask or follow up on that?
Yeah, I have a quick question maybe. There are a bunch of like cybersecurity businesses now that do provide like anti-phishing software, but also provide kind of training for enterprises to raise awareness around phishing. I'm curious like if you have any thoughts on those services and whether that's enough or maybe it's a good starting point, but you know, and any
I have very helpful, but Colin, I have very strong feelings. You can't train your way out of the phishing problem. It's a problem that every time they do a test in the companies that don't have the training, they get about a 20% hit rate. That is about 20% of the people will click on a link they shouldn't have. After the training, about 15% of the people will click on a link that they shouldn't have. So we need technical solutions, and I keep looking for companies that have found ways to spot phishing emails using high performance graphics analysis, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. And I've found a couple who are working on that, but none have perfected it yet. But I just don't believe that you can train your way out of the phishing problem.
That makes sense. And I'll ask a really specific question. I'm curious if you're familiar at all with this company called PhishMe, and they rebranded to CoFence.
Yeah, I'm familiar with PhishMe.
Yeah, they were tied up in like some CFIUS issue where the firm that invested with them had a big Russian LP. But I guess my question was, Do you see that type of thing becoming like more of an issue with government getting more involved in companies in the cyberspace for national security reasons?
Yeah, I don't believe FishMe was the one that had Russian LPs. I think it was another company which is now named Cofense.
Yeah, they changed their name. They used to be FishMe and changed it to Cofense.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, your question again regarding?
Yeah, I guess it was around, do you think that that's sort of an isolated situation, or what do you think about investment firms that, have LPs from China and Russia and other, nation states that might have complicated relationships with the US? Do you think those types of situations will potentially like play out more frequently going forward, or is that kind of a one-off?
Well, I think we have to be concerned if there are foreign investors who have access to trade secrets and other confidential information, technical information in companies that they are investing in. So the general idea is that we, in this country, will limit foreign investment to a financial role only, no board seats, and no access to non-disclosure information. That's hard to carry out, and it's not something that we practice as a country, because we try to invest in foreign companies in some cases. But I personally stay out of foreign investments, either foreign investments into my companies or investments in foreign companies in my case, because I figure that that's not going to benefit either company.
So Bill, related to Colin's question is a question from Spencer that he previously flagged in terms of where the US stands relative to China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, related to cybersecurity, and in what areas do you think we may be significantly behind, and how do you anticipate that the US will catch up on that front?
So I need to know whether the context is offense or defense. I think it's defense. Are we going to?
I was thinking more so defense, but would love to kind of hear your take on both sides of the equation.
Okay, well, let's do the offense because there's less I can say about it. On the offense side, it's pretty well established that the players rank in the order of Russia, China, Iran, and then somewhere in there is Israel. And they might be in the middle of that pack. They might be at the top of that pack. It's hard to say. And as far as where the US is in offensive capabilities, sometimes it's at the top of that heap and sometimes it's not. It depends on the kind of attack that you're talking about. On the defensive side, our problem is twofold. The first is that the offense only has to find one way in, the defense has to find all of the ways. And so that makes for a very unequal equation. It's like having 50 simultaneous equations and somebody gives you a hint on one of them, and so you solve it. They have a lot of success in getting into US companies. The great worry for me is how much success they enjoy in getting into US critical infrastructure. Our financial systems, our electrical grid, our transportation systems. I mean, they actually probably know every passenger on every airplane because those aren't protected very well. And we could go through industry by industry, government organization by government organization, and the answer would vary according to which one you were talking about and how much effort they put into it. But if they determine that they need to get in, they launch what are called campaigns. And the campaigns that Iran, for example, launches against the financial system and North Korea, because that's their need. They need money, they need hard currency. And so that's what they go after. The Russians want technology and the Chinese want technology. And so They go after the aerospace companies and so on. Have you ever taken a look at the Chinese stealth fighter? If you put the picture of the Chinese stealth fighter on one side of the screen and the US stealth fighter F-35 on the other side of the screen, they're virtually identical. And I once, because of the Venona thing that we started out with, I became very good friends with Senator Moynihan. And my gift to him after the ceremony on Venona was a picture of the US Fat Boy, which was our first atomic bomb, and the Russian equivalent side by side. And one had US scientists standing next to it, the other one had a Russian scientist standing next to it, but the bombs were virtually identical. That's the importance of these guys being able to hack into our technological base, because they can copy our technology and it doesn't cost them very much. Computers are cheap. Did that answer your question, Spencer?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thanks so much.
So, Bill, I do want to touch a little more upon modern day security threats and the changing threat landscape. I love this recent quote of yours from a podcast where you said, "We have a choice in cybersecurity. We can continue doing things the way we've always done them, close our eyes and hope for the best, or we can adapt to the changing threat landscape." Can you elaborate a bit more about how we need to catch up in our ability to defend, and how should we think about applications of, for instance, AI and machine learning and security with IoT?
Yeah, we're running out of cybersecurity specialists in this country. At the present moment, there's somewhere between 350 and 500,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the United States, and there are more than 1 million unfilled in the world. And that number is projected to go to well over 1 million by 2023 in this country. It's a real crisis. So we have to begin applying automation, AI, machine learning, and things that will relieve us of the need of having so many people doing this specialized job of cybersecurity. There's also a thing called SOAR, which is the ability to automate all of the responses that our sensors tell us are in existence. I'm always a little worried about SOAR, because if the enemy understands how it works very well, they can use it as a weapon. They can essentially begin to send us signals that set our automated systems off in a course that is not beneficial to us. So we have to be careful about that. Vulnerability assessment is really important. I'm on the board of a company that is called Cyrecon. They've applied machine learning and AI to the deep web. And what they do is they mine the deep web for vulnerabilities that are being discussed by hackers and being exchanged in various IRC or conversations and so on. And they do that in foreign languages as well. That is very, very helpful because it leads them to be able to predict which vulnerabilities by vulnerability class and name are going to be used in real attacks in short order. And so their customers get to get predictions about where they should be patching their software, how they should be locking down things in order to prevent attacks and so on. So in short, we need to smarten the system. We need to do threat assessment. We need to use those threat assessments to guide responses, and then we need to automate those responses.
And on the topic of needing more security experts in government, I do want to touch a bit upon government's role and some comments from Tebe, Melissa, and Spencer in the class. So Tebe noted in terms of your thoughts around how we should think about policy keeping up with the rate at which technology is changing, while Melissa is interested in the government's role, if any, in information security, and particularly global information security. And then Spencer brings up an interesting point in terms of how should we also think about longer dated capital, such as family office money, doing perhaps a better job in working with the US government on network and information security investments. So a lot of topics to cover there, Bill, but would love your initial thoughts on that.
Okay. I used to be on the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Advisory Board. And during that time, I discovered that they were not spending any money on cybersecurity at all. This is an organization that's supposed to be helping us with technologies that are, quote, over the horizon, not on the horizon. And I talked to the director of DARPA and said, this is shameful. She said, well, it's NSA. They won't let us. I said, well, NSA is not in charge. So you should be putting money into it, and you should be telling them where you're putting the money so that they don't have to put money into the same places. And we should have a coordinated effort. They finally put money into cybersecurity, and a lot of it was well spent, particularly on critical infrastructure protection. So the first job of government is to spend money on research and to be able to bring advanced technologies. I mean, a lot of people are skeptical about the government's role in technology, but you know, we all have devices on us today. We're using them right now that came from government programs like VLSI, turned into the high performance chips that we currently use in all of our phones and computers and everything else that we have, and our wearables as well. So the first role is technology and spending money, because they can concentrate that money on things that are not necessarily commercially viable at the moment, but could become viable for commercial applications down the road. That's happening a lot more and more. The second area that they should be involved in, and they are now beginning to fix the problem, is information sharing. The government is going to see in their role as intelligence collectors and defenders of their own organizations and agencies, they're going to see attacks that are going to also occur in the commercial sector and in the critical infrastructure sectors, and they should be sharing that information. You probably noticed that Ann Neuberger from NSA recently became the National Security Advisor for cybersecurity. The new head of cybersecurity for the White House is an ex-NSA person. And so these are people who are highly trained in both offense and defense, and they can help to guide policy on information sharing, on policy on research and development investment, and many other areas as well. So there's a critical role for them, and I think that we're finally getting to the point where we are letting them play out that role in a more credible way.
So Bill, we have about 15 minutes left now. I do want to touch upon quantum computing as well as crypto. So on the quantum computing front, what are the implications of quantum computing on security, especially being able to break RSA, and what does that mean for guarding and encrypting data in the future? And before answering that question, would love if you could first explain to the class a little bit more about RSA.
Okay, well, I talked about AES earlier and how unbreakable it is. And that so you don't try and attack the symmetric key cryptography that is out there, because it's pretty damn strong. But one of the things you can attack is the key system, the keying system. And there are two ways that people distribute keys. One is by physically distributing them in advance. That's NSA's preferred method for many, many years. And the second is by using higher level mathematical exchange, RSA being one of the better known ways of doing key exchange, in that very large prime numbers are used to create a public key and a private key, and the public key is used to encrypt the public key of the recipient is used to encrypt the key that you want to use in your AES system. And they use their private key then to decrypt it, put it into their encryption device, and be able to, software or hardware, and be able to operate an encryption system. So obviously, if you could break RSA or elliptic curve or Diffie-Hellman, the three primary mathematical techniques for exchanging keys, then you would be able to get the keys and be able to decrypt the communications. Well, up until about 15, 20 years ago, that was unthinkable, because the prime numbers involved were like 2048 bits long and almost indeterminable by any conventional computer attack. And then someone said, well, what if we had this computer that could try everything all at once? And then we just take the answers that work. And that's called a quantum computer. Now, I happen to be on the board of the Entanglement Institute and of two other companies that are doing quantum research. So I know a fair amount about quantum computing. I know it's very difficult. We're not likely to see a quantum computer built in the next year, 2 years, 5 years. We don't know about 10 years. And then in 15 years or 20 years, it looks highly likely. So if you had that quantum computer, you essentially could break every encryption system currently in use on the internet. TLS, SSL, all of the ones that are used by your banks and the fintech. And so it's a golden ring or a brass ring, whichever one you want to identify it with, but it's a big prize. And so a lot of money is going into quantum computing. There's also a lot of money going into quantum key exchange, because it turns out that if we can't build a quantum computer, what we do know how to do is to exchange keys using entanglement, so that if the intended recipient has photons that are entangled with the ones that you send, then he can get the key, but nobody else can. Because if they look at the keys, then they no longer are entangled, and so it will fail. Chinese have been successful in doing entanglement key exchange via satellite. There are several companies in the US that make fiber optic key exchange systems at the quantum level. But the big problem is quantum repeating, because fiber destroys the entanglement in about 40 kilometers. So you need to solve that problem. So there's a lot of research going on in quantum computing, quantum repeaters, quantum radars, and quantum sensors. And it's really exciting stuff. It's also very hard science. I'd love it when I go to one of my companies, because there are 12 PhDs in that room with me, and it's a pretty exciting 2 days of exchange of information.
Mm-hmm. Some pretty big technical challenges we need to solve. On the topic of crypto, what are some of the implications of the rise of cryptocurrencies being used to finance not just software-based attacks, but also physical attacks such as kidnappings, for instance, and especially given that a lot of cryptocurrencies are, well, basically the key aspect is being virtually untraceable, and how that makes catching criminals a lot harder. How should we be thinking about the rise of crypto and these new forms of attacks?
Well, the first way you should think about it is all of you are young enough that if quantum computers are ever built, you're going to see cryptocurrencies collapse, because they're built on the kind of public-private key exchange that I was just describing that quantum computers can break. So they have a limited lifetime, at least theoretically, and that makes it kind of interesting in its own right. But the other part of it is what you described, which is the fact that ransomware, now most of the people who do ransomware attacks demand that the payment of the ransom be done in a cryptocurrency, because it is virtually untraceable. By the way, if you ever buy any Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those, make sure you write down the password that you use somewhere, because it's impossible to recover your wallet if you lose the password. And it just goes to ground. It's never recoverable. There's no history of who bought what for you to recover your cryptocurrency.
Yeah, some pretty sad stories of newly minted millionaires not being able to get their money from crypto. So one of the last questions I want to ask you is from Spencer, which is, what are some next generation cybersecurity products that excite you the most?
Yeah, I mentioned Cybercon, and I think it's really exciting because it gives you incredible insight into what the hacking community is doing and where they're going to focus their attention next and how they intend to carry out their attacks. Another one is one of Alsop Louis' companies called RunSafe. It's a very interesting company. Essentially, their approach is to take code. Let's say you've got an application, to take that application code and transform it into a random sequence that it understands, but if you look at it from the outside, you can't understand. So the net result is that it's randomizing the code to observers, but it is not randomizing it to itself. It's able to continue to execute its role and its mission. That's pretty exciting. For example, a lot of the US weapon systems are based on very old code, and the cost of upgrading that code to new operating systems is extremely high. But with their system, you can actually obscure the code so that it still operates and you don't have to upgrade. Other applications of their stuff is in the financial world and in the what's called DevSecOps, that is the development of secure applications in an automated way so that the security portions, particularly for open source portions of their code, can be obscured using their techniques. Another company that I'm excited about is one that it's called Seaport. What it does is it essentially combines a command and control architecture with a security architecture. And it does two things as a result of that. It allows you to have much faster speeds in your encrypted communications, and it also provides for agile cryptography. You can actually change the key for every packet that is transmitted and received. So you can be moving it around in terms of frequency or channel or whatever. At the same time, you are moving it around cryptographically, changing it from AES 128 to AES 256 and then changing the key, virtually every packet. That's pretty difficult for people to work with. It has one other exciting component. It can hide in plain sight. It converts let's say you're running a VPN, it converts the VPN from TCP/IP to UDP. And so it looks like all the Netflix traffic out there. And it's pretty hard to find it if you can't find the headers. So it's also an exciting company. There are others. That's just a sample. Those are real startups there. There are some that are a little more advanced that I also think are doing really great things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that, Bill. I want to sneak in one final question, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic. How has the recent pandemic shifted priorities in regard to security, especially given how people are now using Zoom more often, spending more time on social media like TikTok? Can you talk about if priorities have shifted? Are there new potential avenues for attacks that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, in fact, one of the newest avenues for attacks is to attack the VPNs or the Zoom systems that people are using for working from home. I know companies that are doing everything from software development to team exchanges to customer exchanges to, involving non-disclosure information and trade secrets and so on, that are exposing the information via those means. The second thing is that a lot of large companies have found that, particularly since there was an attack, a supply chain attack against one of the big VPN companies that was discovered within the last 2 weeks, that a lot of the passwords and login credential information has been exposed by people using VPNs from home or using them properly from home. That's one of the reasons Seaport is exciting. It can essentially hide the VPN inside a tunnel. That's a UDP tunnel. And so it's very hard to break into. Even a bad VPN gets pretty difficult to break into.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the big companies, some of the big aerospace companies have had really terrible break-ins that were enabled by work from home.
Bill, thanks again for sharing your experiences with us today. Hasn't been since the Verona project started in 1943, but has been for several decades, both your reflections on the past as well as current threats that we face and the look ahead.